It's Mel. It is April 11th, and I've read 7 books so far in April, so I'm behind starting another vlog-style monthly reading wrap-up. These are videos that I do every month where I try to talk about the books that I've read in the month as close to when I've read them as possible. Sometimes it gets a little bit longer like this. Sometimes it's right away after I've read them, and I string all those clips together for one big, long vlog-style wrap-up. I try to only talk for about 5 minutes about each book. I try to tell you a little bit about what the book's about and what I thought of it, and if I think you should read it too. The first book that I finished in April was The Mirror Cracked from Side to Side, which is the 9th in the Miss Marple series by Agatha Christie. I read this one specifically because it's the next in the Miss Marple series. I'm reading the Miss Marple series in order, mostly on audio, but I do have this physical copy that has 3 other books as well. I read it specifically starting in March because March was March Mystery Madness. The theme for this year's March Mystery Madness was to the 9s, so one of the prompts was to read the 9th in the series. I read quite a few books for that, so check out my March vlog style reading wrap up to hear more of my thoughts and more of the books that I read 9th in the series or that fit other prompts for March Mystery Madness. The Mirror Cracked Side to Side is a Miss Marple story, and it takes place in St. Mary Mead where Miss Marple lives, and Miss Marple is feeling pretty down. She's had a couple of falls and she's definitely getting older. She isn't necessarily feeling her age, but people around her are feeling her age, and she has to have a live-in nurse at the moment, and she's really not happy about that. So all those things and all those people telling her she's old is making her feel old. And what her doctor says is what you really need is a murder or a crime that you can solve, and that's how you're going to feel young again, and that's how you're going to feel rejuvenated. She's not looking for a murderer, but when a young actress, who I think we've met in another or talked about in another of the Miss Marple series, ends up moving into the local manor, which we did see in The Body in the Library, but has been occupied by those people for a while. This American actress throws a big party, and at that party someone is murdered. Of course, Miss Marple's around. She did not go to the party, but people that she knows did go to the party, and they come quickly to tell her what happened and to talk to her about the murder. And of course, Miss Marple sets out trying to solve this murder. So this is, I think, a very popular theme, especially in Golden Age mysteries, that theatrical theater people, actors, actresses, and I think there was a big craze, especially in England at the time, of the theatrical world also being a murderous cesspot to a certain degree, because a lot of the books that I have that are from that golden age, not that I've read yet, because really theatrical and theater and movie type people in the theater are not my favorite to read about, but I have a lot of them that have that theme. So I believe the first of the Roderick Allen books is like that. There's a couple of other mysteries that I've gotten recently that all have that revolving around theater, revolving around movies, revolving around actors theme. But of course, Agatha Christie does it wonderfully, and you meet a large cast of characters, some of which you have known before, some of which you are meeting for the first time, all who have possible motives or possible connections to this murder, and of course we have to go through and solve it. I think I did guess part of the reveal for this particular mystery, but I don't mind guessing them. They're always so fun. I love the Miss Marple stories. I love Agatha Christie, and like I said, this is the 9th of the series, so I think I only have 4 or 5 left to go. The next book that I read in April, I read for Giant Ape-ril, which is a readathon put on by Roy Reads Anything, and it is all about giant apes. So think King Kong, think all the different giant ape movies and books that you can think of. So I decided to read Patricia Wants to Cuddle by Samantha Allen. This is contemporary, modern, horror, thriller sort of book. I've heard about this one for a while and it seemed really interesting. I know it was quite queer, and that was one of the reasons that I was interested in it. And in Patricia Wants to Cuddle, we find a group of people headed to a remote island somewhere in, I think it was Canada or off the coast of Washington State or something like that, and they're on a reality TV show. So this is very much like a Bachelor reality reality TV show where a group of women are trying to win the affection of one man. This TV show has been on for many seasons, many years, and the producers and cinematographers who have been working on it have worked together for a very long time. So we meet this cast of characters, a group of women who are trying to win the affections of this one man, and the kind of twist to this particular show is that it all revolves around a Instagram type social media platform. And it just so happens that this year's Bachelor was the son, I think the son of one of the founders. Not only are they all vying for a love affair and trying to find a love match, they're also trying to become more popular and Insta famous on this Instagram-like platform. So we meet a cast of women, we meet the Bachelor, we meet one of the producers of the show who's been on it for a long time, and we meet a cinematographer that's been on it for a long time who happened to have an on-again, off-again affair. So there's definitely a lot of like infighting, there's definitely a lot of drama, there's definitely a lot of behind-the-scenes drama and sex and whatever else that's going on. And as we meet these women, we find some of them are queer or have queer parents, some of them are not really interested in being there, some of them are super interested in being there, some of them are only in it for the Insta fame, and some of them are there just because they had nothing better to do. At the same time that we're meeting all those people, we're also seeing a chat group for this social media platform, and we're getting gossip and behind the scenes aspects from that mixed media content as well. The group arrives on this remote island, and we start to meet a few people from the island as well. One of the things that the chat room is talking about is about how this very idyllic, beautiful island that should be this hot tourist destination is actually very neglected and forgotten, and why would that be? In the chat group, it's brought up that several women went missing there, and we start to learn their backstory through the chat group and the story of one of the sisters of the missing woman in epistolary blog form entries. So I read this book on audio, and some of those aspects were hard to deal with because of the audiobook. I think I would love to get a physical copy of this book just to see that mixed media aspect and just to see how that was done. There were multiple narrators on the audiobook, and so there were different narrators for all the different women, for the producer, and anyone else that we had perspectives of. And anyone in the chat group had a different narrator, and also reading these blog posts of the woman searching for her sister on the island had a different narrator as well. Unfortunately, the narrations were very similar, especially because most of them were women and their voices were not super distinct or distinguishable, and so a lot of the breaks in the different styles of media and in the different chapters were well delineated by saying whose chapter it was, or by it starting out with a chat group format. But once you were inside of those chapters, the voices were all very similar, so it was hard to kind of remember and keep track of who you were talking about. Also, a lot of the women had different stories, but because they had similar actual voices, you had to wait until they said something about their background to like remember who the person was. At least that was my experience. All these people are on this island. You're hearing different perspectives from all of them. You're hearing about why they're there, and as you get to the island, you start to notice strange things, and one night when they go glamping, glamour camping as part of the show, one of the contestants goes missing. And then our horror slash thriller takes off from there. So it was a really fun romp. I think the first part, when we're meeting all the people and we're having the chat room and we're learning about the history of the island, was a little long and a little boring, but the end being super fast-paced and super exciting kind of made up for it. So you have to get through that first part to kind of get onto the second part. I thought overall it was just a fun thriller, fluffy, silly, nothing too exciting, but I absolutely loved the casual queerness of it. I love books where that is just a given and it's not necessarily explored too deeply, but it also doesn't necessarily need to be explored too deeply. In this book, there were a couple of people who were questioning their sexuality or who were thinking about it, so that was explored in some ways, but it all felt very casual, very normal, very, like a conversation you would have with straight people as well. So I really enjoyed this one. I'm super glad that I read it. It was silly, it was fun, it was a romp. I love a romp, especially in a thriller. The next book that I read in April was Eastbound by Melis de Kerangal, and this was translated from the French by Jessica Moore. This is a super cute, tiny little translated book that I heard about from Brian over at Bookish and a few other people, but I think specifically I wanted to read it because of Brian. And it is about a man traveling on a Trans-Siberian Russian train. He is conscripted into the army, and he is going along with many other conscripted or volunteered soldiers to Siberia to start their training. Only a little bit into the journey, he realizes that he really does not want to do this, and he starts to formulate some plans for going AWOL, escaping from the train, getting out of the situation that he's in. And as he's doing that, he meets a young woman on the train, a young French woman. They don't speak the same language, they don't necessarily understand each other, but this book becomes all about their relationship and how they help each other, and specifically how she helps him to escape his fate that he is not looking forward to. This was really fast-paced. I thought this was going to be more of like a thinking book, ruminating book, but actually this was a super fast-paced, thrilling adventure, and I really enjoyed it. I read this book on audio as well. The audiobook was extremely short, and it was one that I would definitely want to revisit. I'm super glad that I have a physical copy of it to be able to revisit it physically if I want, but I would also reread the audiobook. So if you're into adventure stories, if you're into communication stories, I thought there was a lot in this book about how people communicate and about how you can communicate with other people and getting your idea across. There was definitely some tense moments surrounding that. There was definitely some thrilling moments. So if you are interested in any of those things, I would highly recommend Eastbound. It does not take a lot of time to read, and it was really excellent. The next book that I read in April was Magic for Liars by Sarah Gailey. I read this book for Trans Girl April, and this is by a non-binary author. I've read 2 other Sarah Gailey books so far. I read Upright Women Wanted, which is a Western, post-apocalyptic Western story about librarians, which is awesome. And I also read, what was that one? Oh, I can't think of it. It was about a haunted house. It came out recently. I liked both of those books. I really liked Upright Women Wanted. It was the first book that I read with a non-binary character in it. And then the other book, oh, it's going to drive me crazy. I gotta look. Just Like Home was a haunted house story, but also a story about mother-daughter relationships. So very different books. A lot of casual queerness, a lot of specific queerness, especially in Upright Women Wanted. And Magic for Liars had a lot of that casual queerness as well, which I loved. I would almost call Magic for Liars a dark academia, except I don't think there's quite enough academia for a dark academia book. But if you're interested in dark academia, if you're interested in school settings, if you are interested in magic and magic systems that don't affect everyone in the world, I would definitely highly recommend this. Our main character in Magic for Liars is Ivy, and she is a private detective. She lives in a world where there is magic and magical people, and magic has affected her life, but she herself is not a magical person. She's just a normal human being. Her sister is magic and has been away at a magic school. At first she went there, and now she teaches there, and they have become estranged. Ivy and her sister are twins, but they've taken very different paths. Their mother contracted cancer, and Ivy almost dropped out of school to take care of her mother. She had to be there every day with her in the hospital. She had to deal with the repercussions of her mother being ill and the toll that that took on their father, and she resents her sister for staying away at magic school. We see that Ivy is making her way as a private detective, but she is an alcoholic, and she relies heavily on medicating herself to get over her many issues, both those from the past and those from the present. When Ivy is contacted by the magical headmistress of the school where her sister works to investigate a death that happened there, the headmistress is convinced that it was murder, but the police and the magical police have deemed it it a suicide or an accident. Ivy takes the case reluctantly at first because she knows that she's going to run into her sister. Ivy ends up having to stay at the school for magic, and she has to insinuate herself into kind of every aspect of magical life. And of course, this means that she has to see her sister and they have to come to terms with their strained relationship. I just really love this book. I love the kind of noir PI aspect of it. I loved Ivy's character as a person. I liked her struggles. I enjoyed that there was miscommunication that was quickly solved and communicated in some aspects, especially in parts of Ivy and her sister's relationship. I liked the school setting. I thought it was really interesting. I liked that the magic system was not really explained except in specific instances. I thought it was a super fun, fast-paced, gripping read, and I really liked that it was an adult novel, even though the setting was with a lot of teenagers and young people. I read this one on audio as well, and I thought the reader was really good. I had such a great time with it, and I can't wait to read more of Sarah Gailey. Even if I don't love every single book that they write, I find that their writing style is just very much to my taste. So even though I didn't love Just Like Home, I thought some of the themes were super interesting. I thought some of the reveals were interesting, and I felt the same way about Magic for Liars. I think Magic for Liars is my favorite of the books that I've read by Sarah Gailey so far. The next book that I finished in April was Nevis by Sasha Nespini. This book was translated from the Italian by Clarissa Botsford. Nevis is an older woman living in the Italian countryside. She and her husband own a farm, and this book is set in the past at some point. This book was written in 2020, but it probably is set further back than that, like in the 1950s or 60s. Nevis lives in a rural area, and one day she wakes up to find that her husband has suffered a heart attack and has died in the pig pen, and the pigs have started to eat him. So there are a lot of aspects of this book that have animal violence, but it's very much like farm animal violence. Once she knows that the pigs have started eating her husband's body, and once she takes the body out of the pig pen, she does have to kill the pig because of the farm implications of him having tasted human flesh, I guess. And those are just normal farm things. There's also chickens that she slaughters and things like that. So just to be aware that there is animal violence in this, but it is like animal husbandry and food provenance and not necessarily violence against animals for violence sake. Nevis kind of takes her husband's death in stride, but now she has to do everything for the farm herself. She's a very solitary person. She's very much a person who knows her own mind. She has a daughter with 2 grandchildren living in France, but she's not willing to move in with them, even though they want her to, even though they ask her to. The way that Nevis ends up coping with this new responsibilities and with the loneliness of not being with her husband anymore is she ends up becoming enamored with one of her hens, and she brings this hen inside. The hen sleeps near her bed and keeps her company all day and now lives inside. One day after watching TV with the hen becomes paralyzed or hypnotized, and Nevis calls the local vet. So that is basically all the synopsis tells you, and when I've heard people talk about this book, that's all they say and that's all they talk about. So I really thought that this story was going to be about Nevis and her hen and how the hen affects Nevis's life, and I thought it was going to be more a story about the farm and things like that. But I think it's not spoilers to say that that's not what this book is about. This book is not really about Nevis and the hen. This book is really about Nevis's past and Nevis's identity and how her identity has changed over time, the people who have come in and out of her life, the love affairs she's had, her feelings about her husband, her feelings about her child. So it's really more about that, and I think that that's a better way of going in, because I was a little confused and disappointed that the hen part is really only the first quarter, if that, and then the rest of it is what I just mentioned, all about Nevis's life and about the lives of other people involved in her life. I did really enjoy this book, but I went into this book thinking that Sasha Nespini was a woman, and there were some things and some ways of talking that I was like, is this written by a woman? This doesn't feel like it. And it turns out that Sasha is a man, and it made a little bit more sense about some of the attitudes towards Nevis's decisions and about her life were written by a man. Like I said, I still enjoyed it, and I was super happy to have read it, and once I kind of realigned my expectations to what the book actually was and not what I was hoping it was, and I realigned my expectations of this being a book written by a man as opposed to a book written by a woman, I ended up enjoying it even more. I read this book on audio. I've been reading a lot of audiobooks lately. I swear to God, finding the library online and finding audiobooks through the library has like changed my life for the better so much. If you want to see a video on that, let me know. It's something that I've been toying with doing a short video about. So I would highly recommend Nevis. It was a great translated work. I haven't read that many books translated from Italian, so I was super happy to read it. I thought it was really interesting. There's a little bit of mystery. There's a little bit of suspense. There's a little bit of love. There's a little bit of hate. So if you're interested in a very short story all about those things, I would definitely give it a try. The next book that I read in April was also on audio, and that was The Old Woman with the Knife by Gyu Byung-mo, translated from the Korean by Chi Young Kim. So this is another very short audio book about an old woman named Hornclaw, or called Hornclaw. That's not actually her name, but that is how she's referred to in the book. And we quickly learn that Hornclaw is an assassin. So she's definitely getting older. They call her grandma at the office as a term of endearment and respect. She's still doing her job. So throughout the book, we learn about Hornclaw's job, how she's feeling now as she's getting older, as she's having aches and pains, as she's having to slow down a little bit, and as her mind is slowing down a little bit. She's definitely not senile or anything like that, but sometimes she forgets when she fed her dog last. Sometimes she forgets certain things, but she very distinctly remembers how to be an assassin and what she needs to do in order to fulfill her job. At the office, which they call an extermination office, there are quite a few young people, and one of the young people, who is called Bullfighter, has been giving Hornclaw a hard time. So this book also revolves around that relationship and about how Hornclaw is trying to understand why this brash young thing is kind of all up in her face a lot of times. Throughout the book, we find out more about Hornclaw's life, how she got into the assassin gig, and why she is struggling now, and what is going to be the potential of her getting older and potentially needing to be retired. We find out that there are connections to her life and Bullfighter's life. We find out connections to the other people that we meet in this story, and the story kind of takes off from there. I've heard mixed things about this book, but I really liked it. I thought it was super fun, super fast-paced. It definitely does not have a fully Western writing style, and it doesn't follow the fully Western beats of a thriller or a suspense novel, but I thought it was extremely thrilling, extremely suspenseful. You really care about Hornclaw, and you feel her getting older and the potential of what that means for her life, for her profession, and for the people in her life. But you also see her vulnerabilities showing through, and how she, after all these many years of being a solitary assassin, has started to crave connection with people and with animals. Also, a lot of translated work that I've read has this idea of calling people by their mannerisms or demeanor, or having their names or what they're called be a reflection of what they actually are. And I really enjoyed that in this book, down to Hornclaw's dog. Everyone is kind of called by a name that she has invented for them, or that someone has invented for them. And then you see certain people who are spoken about by their actual name, and it really makes an impact on the connection that Hornclaw has to those people and the connection that you as a reader has to those people. There's There's some thrilling moments in this, like I said. There's some fight scenes, there's some excitement, and I think it goes right along with Killers of a Certain Age and the Thursday Murder Club and the Mrs. Polifak series in this idea of an aging, a senior protagonist who is still a fighter, who is still capable of doing things, but how being older does have certain consequences as well. So I would definitely highly recommend this book as a super quick audio book, fun, thrilling, older protagonist, a Korean work, which I really enjoy. The next book that I finished in April was A Lot by Brian Washington. I read this book for the February TBR spin, which was to read something that felt summery on the cover. So a open fire hydrant felt pretty summery to me. This is a book of short stories by Brian Washington. This is the second Brian Washington I've read. I also read his debut novel, which was Memorial. Brian Washington is a Black American queer author who is from Texas, and A Lot is all centered around a certain area in Texas and the different neighborhoods in that area. So each story is pretty much titled with an area of that part of Texas. There's a map of the area in the beginning, which is interesting, and Lot is a collection of short stories, yes, but throughout this collection there are several short stories that are connected. So the first short story and then many of the other short stories follow the same family of people, two brothers and a sister, their mother, and follows a story about how their father came to leave them and how the family kind of came to break up. So I really enjoyed those stories the most, and I really liked seeing the progression in time and emotion and family in those stories of these brothers and sister, of their mom and their relationship with their mom. And I think these were the most kind of auto-fiction of the stories, because our main character in those stories is a queer Black Latinx boy growing up in Texas. This book reminded me a lot of The House on Mango Street. It has a lot to do, all the stories have a lot to do with coming of age and realizing your identity, whether that's just as a person or whether that's your queer identity. It has a lot to do with the relationships between children and parents. It has a lot to do with the relationships of people who have been abandoned by their parents or neglected by their parents and those who have been taken care of by their parents. And every story is touched by the immigrant experience in Texas concerning various groups of immigrants. So I thought it was really interesting. It was really good. Brian Washington is definitely a very simple, plain writer. His prose is very easy to understand, but a lot of these short stories, almost all of them, were told in kind of short vignettes or even short chapters within the short stories. Some of these stories were extremely short, only a couple of pages long. Some of them were more 20, 25 pages long, but all of them have these big breaks in them, chapter breaks or vignette type breaks. Some of the stories I liked more than others, and like I said, I really like the ones revolving around this family that we got to meet and we got to continue to grow with the most. But I did enjoy it, and I'm glad that I read it. You can see more of my thoughts on this one in my TBR Spin vlog. I am super far behind in my TBR Spin reading, so hopefully I will have quite a few more of those coming out soon. So those were the first 7 books that I read in April, and when I read some more, I will let you know. It is April 29th, and I have not checked it in quite a while, so I have a huge stack of books that I need to talk about, and I also have some books that I read on audio. So let me look at those and see what the last book we spoke about was. Okay, the last book that I talked about was Lot, I believe. So the next book that I read in April was All Boys Aren't Blue by George M. Johnson. This book I read on audio, and it is a memoir. George M. Johnson calls it a memoir manifesto. And in this memoir manifesto, which is designed for teens, George M. Johnson is talking about his life growing up in New Jersey, in Paterson, New Jersey, as a queer Black boy, and it talks about his family, his relationship with his family, his relationship to his friends, his cousins, the love and support they gave him, being a queer man at the time, and then transitioning into a non-binary person. Johnson refers to themselves as they, them, and so we will too. And so this is really about their life from a very, very young age, some traumatic things that happened to them growing up in a rough neighborhood, but having the love and support of their family, their relationship with their very big family, their relationship with their many siblings and their mother and father. There was some abuse that they suffered and other hardships that they suffered just growing up queer and Black in America. It's an interesting book. I would have liked to have seen a physical copy of it. I still would like to see a physical copy of it because it is told in different ways. Sometimes Johnson is talking directly to us. Sometimes it's almost as if they're writing a letter to their family members or people that they know, people that have wronged them, people that have helped them through things. So I think it would be an interesting book to look at physically. I think it's a great jumping off point. Things are talked about in a very plain language, negative things, positive things, queerness, sex, and other topics are talked about in a way that young people could definitely understand. And I think that it's a good book and a good jumping off point for if there are things that young people don't understand that they can then talk to their family, talk to their teachers, talk to other people about and have explained to them, which is awesome. This is one of the most banned or contested books in the US right now, and it's really so stupid that anyone would contest this, and this is definitely a book that I think would benefit young queer people, 100% young non-binary people, people who are questioning or learning about their own gender identity, as well as being a very accessible read for adults or older people who are just learning about those things as well, either in themselves, in young people that they know, or in society at large. So I would definitely highly recommend this one. George narrated the book themselves, and it was really fun to listen to their own story in their own voice. You can hear more of my thoughts on All Boys Aren't Blue in my trans reading video I did. So April was Trans Girl Readathon, and I did read All Boys Aren't Blue specifically for that readathon. I also made a video of books that I had read already in April and or was planning to read in April. So if you want to hear more of my thoughts closer to when I actually read the book, you can go to that video. I will leave it listed down below. The next book that I finished in April was The Ones We're Meant to Find by Joan, I think this is pronounced Joan He. I have to look it up. Joan He or Joan Ha or Joan He. Joan He. Maybe it's Joan He. Joan He. I don't know. Anyway, this book, I also have a lot more thoughts, a video that I believe comes out before this one because this was my TBR spin book for March. I'm very far behind on my TBR spin books, but I do have a dedicated vlog to reading this one. This is one that I have been wanting to read for such a long time. It's so beautiful. This is such a beautiful book. Gorgeous end papers, beautiful cover. I found this book in a little free library on Long Beach Island, New Jersey, and it was also signed by the author. So beautiful, beautiful book. I'm glad to have finally gotten to it. This is a YA book about two sisters, one of whom is stranded on an island, and her sister, who is still living in this kind of eco community in the far future, believes her to be dead. So the story follows both sisters kind of going back and forth, and we learn all about the one sister's predicament of being on this island and the things that she's done to survive and the things that she does to survive and her great drive to get back to her sister. And we see the other sister living back at their home city, what she's doing to kind of deal with her sister's death, as well as come to grips with all the horrible eco-catastrophe that's going on in her home. The sister at home is a scientist, and so she has been trying to come up with ways to alleviate the problems that she and her sister face when they're together and try to find new ways for their community and their society to overcome the climate crisis and the ecological crises that are going on and have created the world in which they now live. So this book is very much like a cli-fi book. It's very much about science fiction. It has a lot to do with AI and the idea of intelligent robots and how those might come about and what we might see in the future from things like that, and how different communities and different societies would deal with global catastrophe, would deal with deadly pollution, would deal with water, sea, food being polluted to the point that people have to change their lifestyles. The Ones We're Meant to Find gets a lot of mixed reviews, and I think the majority of people that I've seen ended up not liking it. They are interested in the concept, but they end up not liking the ending. They end up not liking where this book goes, and it is a YA book, so you are dealing with a lot of like angst of the two sisters in their own ways, and there's love stories connected to the two sisters as well, which seems a little unnecessary, but so I could see how people don't really like that YA aspect. And then I think the biggest problem with this book is that it goes in a lot of different directions. There's a lot of things going on here. Like, there's the love stories, there's the sister relationship, there's the climate catastrophes, there's the being stuck on an island survival story, there's the AI/robot bot component, there's betrayal, there's family dynamics, there's like all this stuff happening, and to me it just felt overwrought. Like, there was just so much happening that it was really hard to fully flesh out each aspect. I think that overall it does all connect, and I see why it is, but I almost think that this could have been like a small series, like maybe a series of shorter books, like a duology of shorter books or a trilogy of shorter books. That way you would have gotten to like explore a little bit more deeply some of the ideas without it seeming so like jam-packed, so like smushed together. I did end up liking this one. I don't think it's like a favorite or anything, but it is one that I could see myself revisiting, and now knowing how the story ends and where the story goes, maybe getting a little bit more out of. I do think it had that YA angstiness and love affair kind of vibe that I don't love, but I think the rest of the story and what was going on with it was strong enough to carry it, you know? So you can see more of my thoughts on this in my TBR Spin March vlog. The next book that I finished in April was The Weary Blues by Langston Hughes. This is the second book of poetry that I've read by Langston Hughes, and the first book was kind of an anthology, a bunch of his poems that were put together later, and that was The Panther and the Lash, and that was his last collection. This is one of his first collections, and it has a lot more to do with his early life, his traveling around with his parents when he was young, and then later joining a merchant ship and sailing and traveling via ship to different places, like various countries in Africa and various other countries in general. It also has to do with Harlem and his learning about Harlem for the first time, moving to Harlem, so it has some of his poems and impressions of that time, as well as other places in the US. So I really like this collection. I think I liked The Panther and the Lash more because I think it had a little bit more to do with more current topics like the civil rights movement, whereas this one felt definitely a little bit older and had some poems that felt a little bit older to me as well. So there, I did tab a lot at the bottom, and I definitely plan on continuing with Langston Hughes' works. I'm excited to read more of his poetry and also more just work in general by him. I know he has plays, stories, novels, children's books, I think even, all sorts of things. I read this because it's National Poetry Month. I've been reading a lot of poetry, but it is also the poetry readathon put on by Charlie Heathcote and Charlie Brooks. I will leave their channels listed down below, and this is one of the first books of poetry that I read for that. Next, I read Murder at the Baseball Hall of Fame by David Daniel and Chris Carpenter. This is a sports cozy mystery, a baseball cozy mystery, which I read for my opening day vlog. So this is the second year in a row that I have worked on a vlog about baseball all around opening day. Last year I tried to get it out around opening day. This year I started it on opening day, and this is one of the two books that I'm reading for that. I know it's been more than a month since opening day, and I'm not sure when that vlog is going to come out. So you will see more of my thoughts on this in that vlog eventually, along with the other books that I am reading for it. This is a cozy mystery written in the 1990s, I believe. Yeah, 1996. And it follows Frank Branco, who is a ex-cop from Boston. He happened to get tickets to go to the Hall of Fame opening ceremonies, and he is at a party one of the nights when a car crashes through the woods, crashes into a gazebo, and bursts into flames. Frank tries to retrieve the driver, and as he does, he kind of thinks that maybe the driver is already dead. This takes Frank on a long journey all around various places in the East Coast, back to Boston, to Cape Cod, to Provincetown, to New Jersey, to Florida, etc., to find out what happened to this man in the car and what caused the death of this man, if it was an accident or something else. So this is a really fun little rompy detective novel where we find out some of Frank's past, why he's no longer a police officer. We find out the different people that he allies himself with and works with in his detective work, and then also a kind of very twisty, complicated mystery having to do with an ex-baseball player. It was definitely fun. There's a lot of baseball references, and there's a lot of talk about various baseball players as well as different baseball things. Like one of the clues that Frank finds is a scorecard, and he has to kind of decipher the scorecard and figure out what it means to the case. He also travels to Ocean Grove, New Jersey, which is the town right next to mine, which was super fun. Very exciting that it was mentioned, and Asbury Park was mentioned, like totally random. I had no idea. I did pick this up at a local used book sale recently, so it could have been that the person before me knew it. This is the second baseball cozy mystery that I've read, and I definitely liked this one more. It was very weird. It was very twisty. It was very 90s. There's like a whole sex element, porn element that's like bizarre and kind of comes out of nowhere. This definitely isn't a book that you could solve as a mystery lover, as a mystery reader, but I don't mind that. It was just silly and fun and like fell apart at the end, but like totally enjoyable. So I think I will definitely try to continue my tradition of reading baseball cozy mysteries around opening day time. Hopefully next year it'll be a little bit more timely, but you know. The next book that I read in April was Clear by Christie Davies. This actually came out on April 2nd, and I was lucky enough to find a ARC in a little free library in Belmar, New Jersey. I think I found it back in March, and it was one of my anticipated books of the year. I first heard about it, I think actually in maybe a Goodreads giveaway. I was just going through and it looked interesting, and then I heard Simon Savage talk about it. But by the time I read this, I had no idea what it was. I couldn't remember a single thing about it, and I read it on audio. It was extremely short. I got the audio from Libby, and it was super fast, easy to read. I think the audiobook's only like 5 hours or something. So going into it pretty much blind was interesting because it is told in these very short chapters, and they go back and forth between several people. We start out on kind of a remote island landscape off the coast of Wales. Christie Davies is a Welsh author, and we are learning about one man who has been living on these islands and tending to them for quite a long time. It's a little bit unclear when this is set. Like, it is not current, but it's not super old. We meet this man and we find out how his family lived on the island, but how they subsequently moved, and now he's lived on the island alone for quite a long time. And then we also are meeting a vicar and his wife, and how this vicar has taken on a job to go to this island and see what's going on there. And there's more, but I definitely don't want to give spoilers. It's such a short book, and it's such a quick book because the chapters are so short, and because it is told in this very almost vignette-y style. But the main point is that we have a man living on a remote Welsh island, and we have a man coming to this remote Welsh island. It took me a little while to get into the flow of this story, and I think that this is a book that suffered from my overexposure to terrible things. I think this book suffered the way that Foster by Claire Keegan suffered, where I was always expecting something really terrible to happen. I felt the same way about The Sleeping Car Porter. I was expecting there to be abuse and death and destruction. I was expecting there to be sexual assault and murder and discrimination and racism, various other horrible things. Bad things happen in all three of those books, but they are not the violent, disgusting things that I have been led to believe happen all the time by the world. Obviously, by a huge genocide that's going on and a disgusting display of lack of humanity that is happening in our real life. So of course I'm on edge about things like that. But also every piece of media, almost every book has some horrible violence and some disgusting depravity of humaneness that leads me to be trepidatious about every story. Side note, this has a horrible cat death in it right at the end, which I find to be very unnecessary. This story really isn't about that. This story is really a quiet look at these people's lives, a glimpse into their thought processes and their attempts to do the right thing and to be good and to be wholesome and to help others and to be at peace with their fellow man, to be at peace with their environment, to be at peace with their relationships. It was a huge disservice to me that I am so biased and traumatized by the world that sometimes I just can't enjoy a story that at its heart is kind and nice and good. There is tension in this book. There are actions that are not pure, but at the heart, this book is about doing good things and about finding people that you can connect with. So I really enjoyed this one. I think I have to read it again, and I think I have to read it physically next time to let myself experience it not through that tragic lens. It might be interesting to do a vlog where I go back and reread some of those books that I felt that way for and that I had a poorer experience because of my fear and trauma at horribleness of the world. I really enjoyed this one. I would say definitely read it. There are queer themes in this. There are themes of connection of humanity. There are themes of connection of animals and of place. It definitely paints a portrait of this island and of this remote Welsh environment, this like harsh environment, but also beautiful. So I think it's definitely one that if you like those ideas, you should definitely check out. I really enjoyed it. The next book that I finished in April was also for the poetry readathon, and that was American Primitive by Mary Oliver. This is another instance where I have read one other book by this author, by this poet, and that book was a later collection of various poetry that was just joined together, whereas this was a book that was specifically put together. Yes, some of the poems appeared in other places, but this was like a collection that was intended to be a collection rather than just an anthology of various poems from different places. I enjoyed this one. I like this one better than the first one that I read. Everybody loves Mary Oliver, and like I see why. I definitely enjoy that she has themes of nature in her work and of observing nature and of being close to nature and of relating to it, and then also of how nature interacts with people. I think it's interesting that she's so ingrained in like the American Middle West and how that differs from my experience, and how her poetry is at the same time very whimsical but very beautiful as well. But I don't like love her poetry the way most people do. I think a lot of people come to Mary Oliver as their first poet and it just knocks their socks off. And I do love her work. I think it's great, but I don't feel as close of a connection to her work I have to other poets now that I'm reading a lot of poetry. And I also feel like, although I like her nature poetry and everything, sometimes it is a little bit too whimsical. Not as whimsical as like Billy Collins and not as like funny, but there are like funny moments. But I will say that I like poetry that tells a very clear story and that you can imagine yourself in and that you can picture the scene around you. Some other poetry, which I will talk about in a second, did not do that for me or does not do that for me, and I don't find myself connecting with those as much. Nikki Giovanni, who has become one of my all-time favorite poets, I think really draws you in, and I can imagine the scenarios that she is describing in her poetry, and I feel connected with it. She has rage in her poetry, she has beauty in her poetry, and I think maybe there's not enough rage in Mary Oliver's work. Maybe there's not enough of a contrast between nature and destruction. There are a couple of poems in here that do have to do with, you know, death and horrible things that I found interesting. They weren't my favorites, but, you know, I did tab a ton of these. I do plan to continue reading her. And I would say that if you're new to poetry, this is a great place to start. The last book that I've read so far in April is another work of poetry. This is Bint by Ginwa Jauhari. Ginwa Jauhari is a Lebanese author and she lives in Brooklyn, and this is like such a beautiful little pamphlet poetry book by Radix Media. This is just a beautiful little book. I love it. Very short. I think it's only like 25 or 30 pages. And in the very beginning, it talks about how bint is the Arabic word for girl. And her poems definitely remind me a lot of Rupi Kaur and some of the other young female poets that I have read recently. They deal with the transition from girlhood to womanhood, and they deal with unwanted sexual advances or thoughts, actions, feelings that are put upon them by men. But also this one talks a little bit more about like arranged marriages and how that transition from girlhood to womanhood is so brief and such a horrible, hard time. You're getting your period, you're growing hair on your body, you're doing all of these things that seem wrong and gross to a certain extent. And then also you're like immediately getting promised to someone in marriage, or at least that is the tradition. This book also talks a little bit about immigrant experience and the mother character in this, and it reminded me a little of Funny and Farsi and Crying in H Mart and some of the books about mothers. I did really like that aspect of it, the mother-daughter relationship, but also the relationship of an American-born person and their mother who has come to this country, is an immigrant in this country, but has not learned to experience this country in the same way, and who has a totally different take on it, who has their old culture, their old norms, their old mores, and how those sometimes clash with the American culture that they've been thrust into. But I was saying before, I like the ones that I can like really imagine and create a picture of in my mind, and I think that Bint definitely does not do that. Like, there's a lot of poems that there's things that I don't understand. Jauhari does use Arabic words and language which are untranslated in the piece, the poem, that I think intentionally are supposed to be unknown to the reader. And then in the back there is a glossary, which was super cool. I love to look at that and then go back and read some of the poems. I didn't realize it was going to be there, which I thought was neat. But also just some of the concepts and the kind of nebulous, ethereal kind of way that some of these poems are written, or chaotic or archaic or almost, what's the word, like obscured or coded way in which some things are talked about. I find that kind of poetry to be very difficult to read, and I don't connect with it as much. Fish Carcass, which I read earlier this year, was very much like that. That book had just like word salad a lot of times, or had something that in the author's mind was one word but meant another, or was like word association that like the reader can't fully grasp. And you can definitely appreciate the poems without having to understand every nuance, but for me it's just harder to connect with those poems. I see that a lot in young female poets, and I think it's almost because there's a taboo to like, well, I think it's partly just their style, obviously, but I wonder if it's also a taboo to talk about the things that they're talking about, to talk about sexual assault, to talk about rape, to talk about sex, negative negative or positive, to talk about bodily function or bodily fluid, or to talk about emotional whatever, you know, like there's so much of a taboo for women to speak openly and plainly and purely about their experience that I think a lot of times in this kind of poetry it is like obscured to the point of unrecognizable. So I do struggle with that a little, but in the end I really did enjoy this collection and I did tab a bunch. I would love to find more of these works. So I haven't gone on their website yet, but I should, and I should like pick some more up. I think they're great. Another great work of poetry for National Poetry Month and the Poetry Readathon. It's the 30th. I said it was the 29th earlier, but it's actually the 30th. It's the last day of April. I am reading one book on audio and I'm reading another work of poetry, and I might finish those today before the end of the month, and I might not. So you will either see me back here in just a few moments with a wrap-up of the book, all the books that I've already talked about, or you might see me talk about a few more new books before then. But either way, I will be back. I did not end up finishing any more books in April, so I am back with my wrap-up of the wrap-up. So I had a really great reading month. I read for Trans Girl April, I read for National Poetry Month, I read for the Poetry Readathon, I read quite a few books in translation, which is awesome. I read a 2024 release that I was anticipating. I read for a baseball vlog still coming soon. I read for the March TBR spin. I read quite a few works of poetry, and some of those were works by people of color. I was able to finish a Golden Age mystery, always fun. Oh, I also read for the February TBR spin this month. So I'm catching up on my TBR spin, which is awesome. Like I said, I read a lot of varied works by people of color, which is always my goal. And I also read books by queer authors or having queer stories, which again is one of my major goals. I did recently put out a quarter year reading tag with my stats and my goals check-in, so I'm happy to say that going past the first quarter, I am also working on my goals and getting to them. That's very fun. So yeah, I read for a lot of readathons. I read a lot of varied works. I read a lot of new authors this month, which is cool. This book, fantastic, if I didn't make it clear before. And then I read a bunch of authors that I have read like one book from before, but was happy to get to another one. Let me know how your reading went in April. Let me know if you're keeping up with all your goals and all the things that you want to be reading in 2024. And I will be back. Thanks so much for joining me today, and I'll see you in the next one. Bye. Are you using my phone? You might be making long distance calls. Hard to say.